Welcome to the channel where power meets passion, and one decision changes everything. For 3 years, Natasha Miller worked for Jorge Caligari, ignoring the tension that crackled between them like electricity. When Michael Henderson finally asked her out, she said yes, not because she wanted him, but because he seemed safe, predictable, everything her dangerous boss wasn't. She thought Jorge wouldn't care. She was wrong. He watched from the shadows as she let another man drive her home, kiss her goodnight, believe he had a chance. By morning, she realized it was never about jealousy. It was about control. What happens when power becomes personal? Subscribe now if you love dark romance where power shifts, choices have consequences, and no one plays the game better than the one who never shows his hand. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Caligari Industries' 42nd floor as Natasha stared at the city lights, bleeding through the darkness. Her reflection ghosted back at her, sophisticated, composed, everything she'd trained herself to be in the 3 years since she'd started working as his personal assistant. 3 years of walking the razor's edge between professional and something far more dangerous. She could feel his presence before she heard his footsteps. Jorge moved like a predator even in $1,000 Italian suits, and tonight was no different. The air in the office shifted when he entered, becoming charged with that particular tension that made her pulse quicken against her will. Working late again? His voice carried that familiar edge of concern mixed with something darker, something that made her stomach flutter, despite every rational thought telling her to maintain distance. She didn't turn around. Couldn't. Not when her body betrayed her every time those steel-grey eyes locked onto hers. The Morrison acquisition needs to be finalized by tomorrow. The Morrison acquisition can wait. Now she did turn and immediately regretted it. He'd loosened his tie, and the top button of his shirt was undone. Such a small thing, but on Jorge Caligari, even that hint of casualness felt intimate, dangerous. The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of careful distance and mounting tension. She watched him move closer, noting the predatory grace that made boardroom adversaries nervous and made her pulse race for entirely different reasons. "You've been distracted lately," he observed, settling against the edge of her desk with casual possession of her space. "Your mind's somewhere else during meetings." "I haven't been." "Yesterday, when Davidson was presenting the quarterly projections, you missed the discrepancy in his third-quarter numbers. You never miss details like that." Heat flooded her cheeks. He was right. She'd been caught up watching the way Jorge's fingers moved as he took notes, imagining what those hands would feel like against her skin. "Since when do you prioritize anything over business?" She kept her voice steady, professional. The same tone she'd perfected over years of pretending she didn't notice the way his gaze lingered on her mouth when she spoke. His lips curved in what might have been a smile if you didn't know him well enough to recognize the calculating quality beneath. "Since I started noticing that my assistant stays late to avoid going home to silence." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. How did he always know? How did he see through every carefully constructed wall she built? "My personal life isn't your concern." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. Jorge made everything his concern when it came to her, and she'd been fooling herself thinking otherwise. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that she associated with power and danger. "Isn't it?" The question hung between them like a challenge, loaded with 3 years of unspoken desire and carefully maintained boundaries. She could feel the pull of him, the way her body wanted to lean into his space, to finally close the distance they'd both been pretending didn't exist. His hand moved to the desk behind her, effectively caging her between his body and the mahogany surface. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel his body heat, could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. 3 years, Natasha," he murmured, his voice dropping to that register that made her knees weak. 3 years of pretending we don't feel this electricity every time we're in the same room." Before she could answer, her phone buzzed against the glass desk. The sound shattered the moment like a gunshot. Michael's name flashed on the screen. She watched Jorge's expression change, saw the exact moment his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but she'd spent 3 years learning to read the subtle shifts in his mood. learning to navigate the dangerous waters of Jorge Caligari's attention. Answer it. His voice had gone carefully neutral, but she caught the underlying current of something that might have been curiosity. Her fingers trembled slightly as she swiped to accept the call. Hi, Michael. Nat, thank God, I've been trying to reach you all day. Where are you? She glanced at Jorge, who had moved to lean against the window, hands in his pockets, watching her with an intensity that made her skin burn. I'm still at the office. It's almost 10 p.m. Listen, I know this is last minute, but there's this amazing restaurant in Little Italy that just had a cancellation. I managed to get us a table for tonight. What do you say? Michael Henderson. Safe, predictable, everything a woman should want in a man. A marketing executive from the 10th floor with kind eyes and a laugh that never made her pulse race the way Jorge's rare smiles did. He'd been asking her out for months, and she'd been making excuses for just as long, because how could she explain that no man would ever compare to the one currently staring at her like he was solving a complex equation? I don't think tonight is... Actually, Jorge's voice cut through her refusal, smooth and unreadable. Maybe you should go. Her eyes snapped to his, confused. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. Jorge was possessive of her time, of her attention. He'd made other men disappear from her orbit with nothing more than a look, but now he seemed almost amused. The predatory stillness in his posture suggested he was planning something, conducting some kind of experiment with her as both subject and observer. Really? Michael's excitement was audible through the speaker. That's fantastic. I'll pick you up in 30 minutes. I'll meet you at the restaurant, she said quickly, something in Jorge's expression making her cautious about letting Michael know where she was. After she ended the call, silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Why? She asked simply. Jorge straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate precision. Maybe it's time you found out what you really want. The words felt like a challenge wrapped in silk. After 3 years of heated glances and loaded silences, of working late nights that felt more like foreplay than overtime, he was pushing her toward another man, like he was conducting an experiment. And what do you think I want? She heard herself ask. His smile was sharp with something that might have been anticipation. That's what we're about to discover. She gathered her purse and coat, her movements sharp with barely contained emotion. When she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Natasha. She paused but didn't turn around. Couldn't trust herself to look at him without revealing too much. Enjoy your evening. And remember, every choice you make tonight tells a story. The words felt like the opening move in a chess game she didn't fully understand yet. An hour later, she was sitting across from Michael in an intimate restaurant that was everything he'd promised. Candle-lit tables, excellent wine, the kind of romantic atmosphere that should have made her heart flutter. Instead, she found herself thinking about steel-grey eyes and the way Jorge's voice had dropped when he'd told her to enjoy herself. You look incredible tonight, Michael said, his eyes warm with genuine appreciation. That dress is perfect on you. She glanced down at the burgundy silk that she'd worn, thinking about someone else entirely. Thank you. The conversation flowed easily enough. Michael talked about his work in marketing, his weekend hobbies, his plans for the upcoming quarter. Safe topics that revealed a man who lived within carefully defined boundaries. But as the evening progressed, she found herself comparing everything to Jorge. Michael's laugh was pleasant, but lacked the dangerous edge that made Jorge's rare humor so compelling. His observations about business were competent but predictable, missing the sharp intelligence that made Jorge's strategic thinking so fascinating. I have to admit, Michael said over dessert, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his, I've been wanting to ask you out for months. There's something about you that's magnetic. His touch was warm, gentle, everything it should be, but it didn't send electricity racing through her system the way a simple brush of Jorge's fingers did when he handed her documents. Michael was everything she should want, she realized, as dinner progressed. Attentive without being overwhelming, funny without trying too hard, successful enough to be interesting but not so powerful that he made her feel like prey. He told her about his weekend plans, hiking in the mountains, visiting his sister's new baby, coaching Little League on Sundays. Safe, wholesome pursuits that painted a picture of a man who would never complicate her life or make her question everything she thought she knew about herself. "I have to admit," Michael said over dessert, "I was surprised when you said yes tonight. I was starting to think you might be seeing someone else." "Why would you think that?" "Just the way you are at work sometimes. Like your attention is always divided, like part of you is somewhere else." He smiled, but there was something calculating in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "But I guess that's just how dedicated you are to your job." Something in his tone made her skin prickle with unease, but before she could analyze it further, he was standing, offering his hand. "Ready to go? I thought I could drive you home. Maybe we could talk more. I feel like we're just getting to know each other." The suggestion was innocent enough, but something about the way he said it made her remember Jorge's words. "Every choice tells a story." "That would be nice," she heard herself say, and immediately wondered what story this choice was telling. The drive to her apartment building passed in comfortable conversation, but she found herself noticing things she hadn't before. The way Michael's grip on the steering wheel was a little too tight, the way his laugh seemed forced when she didn't respond to his jokes with quite enough enthusiasm. More concerning was the route he took, not the most direct path to her building, but one that passed through several areas where traffic cameras were sparse. She told herself she was being paranoid, but Jorge's lessons in observation had taught her to notice details. "You know," Michael said as they sat at a red light, "I've always wondered what it's like working so closely with someone like Caligari. He has quite a reputation." "He's a demanding boss," she replied carefully. "Demanding." Michael's smile had an edge to it now. "That's one word for it. Word around the building is that he's particular about the people in his inner circle. Protective." The way he said protective made her pulse quicken, but not with attraction, with warning. When they pulled up to her building, the street seemed quieter than usual, darker. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Michael said, turning to face her in the confined space of his car. "I hope this is just the beginning." He leaned closer, and she knew he was going to kiss her. This was the moment, the choice Jorge had been curious about, the test she didn't fully understand. She could stop this, could pull away, make excuses, keep things professional and safe. Instead, she let Michael's lips meet hers. The kiss was gentle, careful. Everything a first kiss should be. He tasted like wine and possibility, and for a moment she tried to lose herself in it. Tried to imagine what it would be like to want someone who was safe. But even as Michael's mouth moved against hers, even as his hand came up to cup her face with reverent gentleness, all she could think about was how different this was from what she really wanted. How different it was from the controlled fire she saw in Jorge's eyes every time he looked at her. The kiss deepened, and she felt Michael's other hand move to her waist, pulling her closer in the confined space of the car. His touch was possessive in a way that felt presumptuous rather than thrilling. When they broke apart, Michael's eyes were bright with satisfaction and something deeper. "Can I walk you up? I'd love to see you again this weekend." "Actually," she said, her voice somehow steady despite the chaos in her chest, "I think I should go up alone. Early morning tomorrow." His face fell slightly, but he nodded like the gentleman he was trying to be. "Of course, I'll call you tomorrow." She got out of the car and waved as he drove away, playing her part until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did she allow herself to scan the street, looking for signs of surveillance she both dreaded and desperately hoped to find. The black Maserati was parked across the street, engine running, waiting. Her heart stuttered to a stop, then started again, faster. Jorge stepped out of the shadows near her building's entrance, and even in the dim streetlight, she could see the predatory stillness that meant he'd been watching, analyzing, drawing conclusions. "Did you enjoy your evening?" His voice was silk over steel, polite and absolutely devastating. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "It was educational." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or approval. "Good." Because that was the point. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his body heat in the cool night air. "Tell me, Natasha, what did you learn?" The question was loaded with implications she was only beginning to understand. This hadn't been about her having a normal evening with a normal man. This had been Jorge conducting an experiment, and she had been both subject and observer. "I learned," she said carefully, "that safe isn't always what it appears to be." His smile was sharp, predatory. "Continue. And that I've been lying to myself about what I actually want." She took a breath, meeting his gaze directly. She stared up at him. This man who'd orchestrated her entire evening just to prove a point, who'd pushed her toward another man's arms to make her realize where she truly belonged. "You," she whispered, "I want you." His laugh was low, triumphant. "Finally." Before she could ask what he meant, he was moving, backing her against her building's brick wall with controlled intensity. His hands braced on either side of her head, caging her in without touching her. "3 years," he murmured, his voice rough with something she'd never heard before. "3 years I've watched you pretend we don't feel this. 3 years of careful distance and professional courtesy." His thumb traced along her jawline, the touch gentle but possessive. "But tonight, you let another man kiss you, and now you're looking at me like you finally understand what you've been running from." She could barely breathe with him this close, with his scent surrounding her and his eyes burning into hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "I'm not running anymore," she managed. "Good," he said, lowering his head until his lips were a breath away from hers. "Because I don't chase, Natasha. I simply wait until people realize they can't stay away." When he kissed her, it wasn't like Michael's careful exploration. Jorge kissed her like he was claiming territory he'd already mapped, like he was taking something that had always belonged to him anyway. His mouth was demanding, possessive, stealing her breath and her ability to think clearly. She could taste the controlled violence in him, the barely leashed power that made him dangerous to everyone except her. One hand moved to tangle in her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss, while the other pressed against the small of her back, pulling her against him until there was no space between their bodies. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing hard. Her lips felt swollen and she could taste him on her tongue. "That," he said against her mouth, "is what you've been avoiding for 3 years." She stared up at him, lost in the intensity of his gaze, feeling like prey caught in the sights of an apex predator. But what terrified her most wasn't the danger radiating from him. It was how much she wanted to surrender to it completely. "So what happens now?" she whispered. His smile was all teeth and dark promise. "Now you decide if you're brave enough to stop playing it safe." What would it mean to choose Jorge Caligari over safety, and was she prepared for the consequences of that decision? She woke up in her own bed, alone, with the taste of Jorge still on her lips and a business card on her nightstand that hadn't been there before. "Lunch, 1 p.m., the address on the back. Come alone." Jake. The restaurant was one she'd never heard of, tucked away in a part of the financial district where power brokers made deals over expensive meals. When she arrived, Jorge was already seated at a corner table that gave him a clear view of every entrance and exit. The maitre d' led her through the dining room with the kind of deference reserved for VIP guests, and she noticed how other diners glanced up as she passed, recognition flickering in their eyes when they saw who was waiting for her. Jorge stood when she approached, pulling out her chair with old-world courtesy that somehow felt more intimate than casual familiarity. "You came," he observed, settling back into his seat. "Did you think I wouldn't?" His smile was enigmatic. "I thought you might need time to convince yourself that last night was a mistake." She met his gaze steadily. "Was it?" "That depends entirely on what you want to do about it." Before she could answer, a server appeared with wine she hadn't ordered, something expensive and French that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. Jorge dismissed the man with a subtle nod, leaving them alone in their corner of cultivated privacy. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of people who controlled significant portions of the city's economy. She recognized a few faces from business magazines and news programs, all of them treating Jorge's presence as entirely natural. "This isn't about lunch, is it?" she asked. "Nothing with me is ever about what it appears to be about. He lifted his wineglass, studying her over the rim. But you're starting to understand that, aren't you? She was. 3 years of working for Jorge had taught her to read the undercurrents, to understand that every gesture had meaning beyond the obvious. This lunch, like last night's encouragement to go out with Michael, was a test. What are you testing this time? His laugh was approving. How quickly you learn the rules of a different game. And what game is that? The one where we stop pretending we're just boss and employee. He set down his wineglass with deliberate precision. The one where you acknowledge that you walked into my world 3 years ago and never really left. The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through her belly, made her remember the way his mouth had claimed hers against the brick wall. Your world, she repeated. And what exactly does that entail? Honesty, about what we both want. About what you've been thinking every time you look at me across a conference room. His voice dropped to that dangerous register that made her pulse race. About what you were thinking about when Michael Henderson was kissing you last night. Heat crept up her neck at the accuracy of his assessment. Even during Michael's gentle kiss, she'd been comparing it to what she imagined Jorge's mouth would feel like against hers. You were watching, she said. It wasn't a question. I told you I don't chase, but I do pay attention to what interests me. His eyes tracked over her face, cataloguing every reaction. And you, Natasha, have been interesting me for a very long time. The server returned with lunch she also hadn't ordered, but it was perfect, sophisticated, thoughtful, exactly what she would have chosen if she'd been paying attention to the menu instead of trying to navigate Jorge's psychological chess game. So you planned this, she observed. I plan everything that matters. He cut into his meal with surgical precision. The question is whether you're ready to stop reacting to my plans and start making some of your own. What do you mean? I mean that intelligent women don't just accept the game they're given. They learn the rules and then find ways to use them to their advantage. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and she felt something shift inside her chest. For 3 years, she'd been responsive to Jorge's moods, anticipating his needs, reacting to his moves like a very skilled assistant. But he was suggesting something different now. He was suggesting she become a player instead of a piece. And how does one learn the rules of your game? His smile was sharp with approval. By paying attention, by understanding that power isn't about what you can force, it's about what people choose to give you. Like trust, like loyalty, like attention, like access to things they value. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Like the ability to influence their decisions without them realizing it's happening. The casual way he described manipulation should have concerned her. Instead, she found herself fascinated by the elegant precision of it. Is that what you do with me? What do you think? She considered the question seriously, analyzing 3 years of interactions through this new lens. Jorge had never forced her to stay late, but he'd made it clear that her dedication was noticed and valued. He'd never demanded her attention, but he'd created situations where giving it felt natural, inevitable. Even his choice of restaurants, wines, gifts for clients. Everything designed to create specific impressions, to guide people toward the conclusions he wanted them to reach. You make people want to please you, she said slowly. You create environments where the choice you prefer feels like the only logical option. Very good. His approval was like a drug, making her want to earn more of it. What does that tell you about operating in my world? She found herself leaning forward slightly, genuinely intrigued. That the most effective power is invisible power. For just a moment, something flickered across Jorge's features, surprise, perhaps even admiration, before his usual composed mask returned. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed against the table. Michael's name flashed on the screen and she saw Jorge's eyes track to it with predatory focus. Answer it, he said casually. She swiped to accept the call. Hi, Michael. Nat, thank God. I've been thinking about last night all morning. His voice was warmer than usual, more intimate. I was hoping we could have dinner tonight, maybe something more private than a restaurant. Across the table, Jorge leaned back in his chair, watching her with the same intensity he brought to complex negotiations. Tonight might not work, she said carefully. Come on, After the connection we had last night, I know you felt it too. That kiss. Michael's voice dropped suggestively. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Something in his tone made her skin prickle with discomfort. This wasn't the same man who'd been sweetly nervous during dinner. This Michael sounded possessive, presumptuous. Michael, I think we should take things slowly. Slowly? His laugh had an edge to it. Nat, we've been dancing around this for months. I think I've been patient enough. Besides, I already made reservations at this great little place, very intimate. We'll have plenty of privacy to talk. The way he said talk made her stomach turn. Jorge was watching her face, reading every micro-expression with his usual ruthless accuracy. I need to go, she said firmly. We'll talk later. Wait, Nat. She ended the call and stared at Jorge across the table. He wasn't like that last night. Wasn't he? Jorge's voice was thoughtful. Or were you not in a position to notice? She replayed the evening in her mind, looking for signs she'd missed. The way Michael's grip on the steering wheel had been too tight. His calculation when he'd mentioned her divided attention. The possessive undertone when he'd talked about this being just the beginning. The way he'd chosen a route with fewer traffic cameras. The presumptuous way he'd assumed she'd want him to come upstairs. You knew, she breathed. You knew he would be like this. I know men like Henderson. They present themselves as safe options, but safety is often just another word for control wrapped in prettier packaging. The casual accuracy of his assessment was both impressive and unsettling. Jorge had read Michael's character in minutes, had probably known exactly how the evening would unfold before he'd ever encouraged her to go. So last night was what? A demonstration? Last night was an education. His voice carried that note of controlled authority she'd learned to recognize, about the difference between what appears safe and what actually is. And you? His smile was sharp, honest. I'm not safe, Natasha, but I'm honest about what I am, and I don't pretend gentleness to get what I want. The words should have scared her. Instead, they sent arousal spiraling through her system like a drug. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Michael. Jorge glanced at the screen. He's persistent. She read the message and felt ice slide down her spine. Don't play games with me, Nat. I know where you work. We need to finish our conversation. Jorge glanced at the screen, and for a split second she caught something raw in his expression. Genuine anger, not the controlled kind he usually displayed. Interesting, he murmured, his voice returning to that silk-over-steel tone. It seems Michael Henderson is about to learn some important lessons about boundaries. Jorge, finish your lunch, he said calmly, but she could see the predator stirring beneath his civilized surface. We're going back to the office. 20 minutes later, they were in the elevator of Caligari Industries, and she could feel the controlled violence radiating from Jorge like heat from a furnace. What are you going to do? I'm going to solve a problem before it becomes a bigger problem. The elevator opened on their floor, and she saw immediately that something had changed. Security guards were stationed at positions they'd never occupied before. Sarah, Jorge's usual assistant, was nowhere to be seen, but Marco stood near Jorge's office door, alert and professional. Sir, Marco said as they approached, Henderson's been trying to access the executive floors. Security turned him away, but he's been calling the main number asking for Miss Miller's direct extension. Jorge's expression didn't change, but she felt the shift in his energy, from controlled to deadly. Where is he now? Lobby, making a scene about needing to speak with Miss Miller urgently. Jorge turned to her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse race, not fear but anticipation. This, he said quietly, is how problems get solved in my world. He moved toward his office with the fluid grace of a predator, and she found herself following, drawn by the promise of seeing Jorge Caligari handle a threat to what he considered his. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see down to the lobby where Michael was indeed making a scene, gesturing animatedly at the security desk while several guards maintained careful distance. Jorge picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. Henderson, he said when the call was answered, his voice carrying across the silent office. Jorge Caligari. I understand you're looking for my assistant. Even from across the room, she could hear Michael's voice rising through the phone. That's interesting, Jorge continued, his tone conversational, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're harassing my employee after she declined your invitation. More angry words from Michael's end. I see. And you feel entitled to her time because... Jorge's pause was loaded with deadly calm. Because you bought her dinner. She watched Jorge listen to whatever Michael was saying, his expression growing colder with each word. Let me clarify something for you, Henderson, Jorge said finally, his voice dropping to that register that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Natasha Miller works for me. She's under my protection, and when someone makes her uncomfortable, that becomes my concern. There was a pause as Michael responded, his voice audible through the phone speaker, but not clear enough for her to make out specific words. No, you misunderstand, Jorge continued, his voice taking on the silky quality that meant someone was about to learn a very expensive lesson. I'm not making threats, I'm explaining consequences. You see, I have resources you don't, connections you can't imagine, and influence that extends far beyond this building. Another pause. Your employment at Morrison Marketing, for instance. Did you know they're considering expanding their relationship with Caligari Industries? It would be unfortunate if concerns about employee conduct affected that decision. She could almost hear Michael's sharp intake of breath through the phone. He hung up and turned back to the window. Below, she could see Michael staring up at the building, phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed with anger. He'll leave now, Jorge said simply. How can you be sure? Jorge's smile was sharp as a blade. Because he just realized that his choices are to walk away gracefully or discover what happens when someone threatens what Jorge Caligari values. She stared down at Michael, who was indeed gathering his things and heading for the exit, his shoulders tight with frustration and something that looked like fear. That's it? She asked. That's it. Jorge moved back to his desk, settling into his chair like nothing had happened. Sometimes power is about what you don't have to do. The casual display of influence left her breathless. Jorge hadn't threatened Michael explicitly, hadn't used violence or coercion. He'd simply made it clear that continued harassment would be inadvisable. He'll try again, she said. No. Jorge's certainty was absolute. He won't. Before she could ask how he could be so sure, her phone buzzed with a final text from Michael. I'm sorry, I was out of line. Won't bother you again. She stared at the message, then at Jorge, who was already turning his attention to the documents on his desk, as if the entire situation had been nothing more than a minor interruption. How did you... Power, Natasha, isn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It's about understanding exactly how much pressure to apply and where. He looked up from his papers, his grey eyes intense. It's about knowing that sometimes the most effective move is the one your opponent makes for you. The elegant simplicity of it was both terrifying and impressive. Jorge hadn't destroyed Michael or ruined his career. He'd simply made the cost of persistence too high to justify. Is this what you meant about learning to play the game? This is kindergarten compared to the games that matter. He stood, moving around his desk to where she stood by the window. But yes, this is how intelligent people solve problems, through strategy, not force. He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, feel the controlled power radiating from him. And what if I want to learn more than problem-solving? His smile was predatory, appreciative. Then tomorrow, you're going to see how this world really works. The promise in his voice sent heat and anticipation spiraling through her in equal measure. But as his hand found hers, fingers intertwining with possessive familiarity, she found herself wondering, in choosing to learn Jorge's games, what kind of player was she prepared to become? The next morning, she arrived at the office to find her desk had been moved, not to a different location, into Jorge's office itself, positioned at an angle where she could see both his workspace and anyone who entered. Jorge was already there, immaculate in a charcoal suit, speaking in rapid Italian to someone on the phone. When he saw her, he gestured toward her new position with a look that suggested this change was non-negotiable. She settled into the unfamiliar setup, noting that her new desk was clearly more expensive than her old one, equipped with technology she'd only seen in Jorge's private workspace before. The computer system was different too, more sophisticated, with access to databases and systems she'd never seen before. When she logged in, her security clearance had been upgraded, giving her visibility into projects and documents that had previously been above her level. When he finished his call, she raised an eyebrow in question. "Proximity," he said simply. "If you're going to understand how this works, you need to observe the details." "And the security upgrade?" His smile was enigmatic. "You can't be effective without access to the real information." Before she could respond, Marco appeared in the doorway, carrying a leather portfolio that looked both official and ominous. "The Riverside situation requires attention," he said without preamble. Jorge nodded, gesturing Marco toward the seating area by the windows. "Natasha, join us." She followed them to the elegant arrangement of leather chairs and glass tables that Jorge used for meetings too sensitive for the formal conference room. Marco opened the portfolio, revealing photographs and documents arranged with military precision. "Vincent Castellano," Marco began, sliding a photograph toward her, "owns 3 restaurants in the district where your waterfront project is planned. He's been organizing resistance through what he calls community advocacy." She studied the photograph of a distinguished man in his 50s, then glanced at Jorge. "This is about business?" "Everything is about business," Jorge replied. "But business, like everything else, is about people, their motivations, their pressure points, their relationships." Marco continued his briefing with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Vincent Castellano wasn't just a restaurant owner. He was connected to city council members, environmental groups, and a network of small business owners who could create significant delays for development projects. "What kind of delays?" she asked. "Permit challenges, environmental reviews, community impact studies," Marco explained. "Legal tactics that can stretch a timeline from months to years. And cost millions," Jorge added. "Which is why problems like Vincent Castellano need to be addressed before they become expensive." She watched Jorge during the briefing, noting how he processed information with the same calculating intensity he brought to everything else. This wasn't about threats or intimidation. This was strategic thinking applied to human obstacles. "So how do you address someone like Castellano?" she found herself asking. Jorge's smile was sharp with approval at her engagement. "By understanding what he values more than community activism." Marco continued the briefing, outlining Castellano's business interests, his family connections, his political affiliations. But more than that, he painted a picture of a man who genuinely cared about his community, who saw development as a threat to the neighborhood's character. "He has a daughter," Marco noted, sliding another photograph across the table. "Sofia Castellano, 26, recently graduated from culinary school. She's been trying to open her own restaurant but having trouble securing financing." She looked at the photograph of a young woman with her father's determined eyes, then at Jorge. "You're going to help her." "I'm going to understand what matters to Vincent Castellano," Jorge replied, "and then I'm going to find a way for his interests to align with mine." An hour later, she was in the back of Jorge's Maserati, heading toward a part of the city she rarely visited. The buildings here were older, more authentic, the kind of neighborhood where families had run the same businesses for generations. "Where are we going exactly?" "To have lunch with Vincent Castellano," Jorge replied, checking his phone with practiced efficiency. "He doesn't know we're coming, which gives us the advantage of controlling the conversation's parameters." They stopped outside a restaurant that looked like it belonged in Rome rather than downtown Manhattan. Through the windows, she could see white tablecloths and wine bottles displayed with obvious pride. "This is one of his places?" "His flagship, where he holds court every afternoon, solving his customers' problems and building the kind of loyalty that makes men feel important." Jorge straightened his cufflinks, and she recognized the gesture as preparation for battle fought with words rather than weapons. Inside, the restaurant was exactly what she'd expected. Authentic, warm, filled with the kind of regulars who probably knew the owner personally. Vincent Castellano was indeed holding court at a corner table, gesturing expressively while three other men listened with respectful attention. Jorge approached their table with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being welcomed anywhere. "Mr. Castellano," he said, offering his hand. "Jorge Caligari. I've been admiring your establishment." Vincent's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, wariness, before settling on polite hospitality. "Mr. Caligari, this is unexpected." "The best conversations usually are," Jorge gestured toward her. "My associate, Natasha Miller. We were hoping you might have a moment to discuss some mutual interests." The men at Vincent's table excused themselves with the kind of hasty politeness that suggested they recognized Jorge's name and its implications. Vincent stood, offering his hand to her with old-world courtesy. "Miss Miller, please sit. Can I offer you some wine? The lunch special is excellent today." What followed was a masterclass in sophisticated persuasion. Jorge didn't mention the waterfront development directly. Instead, he talked about the neighborhood's history, its potential, the challenges facing small business owners in a changing economy. Vincent, clearly proud of his domain, warmed to the subject. He talked about his family's history in the area, the customers who'd been coming here for decades, his concerns about gentrification destroying the community's character. "It's about preservation," Vincent explained, gesturing toward the photographs on the walls, showing the neighborhood from decades past. "About making sure development doesn't erase what makes a place special." Jorge nodded thoughtfully. "I understand completely. Though I imagine the challenge is finding the balance between preservation and growth that benefits everyone." "Exactly. But developers," Vincent's expression darkened, "they see only profit margins, not people." "Some do," Jorge agreed. "But what if development could enhance rather than replace? What if growth could strengthen community rather than dissolve it?" Over the next hour, Jorge painted a picture of development that would complement rather than compete with existing businesses. He spoke of improved infrastructure that would bring more customers to Vincent's restaurants, of green spaces that would make the neighborhood more attractive to families. But more than that, he listened. He asked about Vincent's concerns, acknowledged the validity of community resistance, positioned himself as someone who understood the delicate balance between progress and preservation. She watched Vincent's defenses gradually lower, saw the moment when Jorge's vision began to seem less like a threat and more like an opportunity. "You know," Vincent said finally, refilling their wine glasses, "most developers don't bother with conversations like this. They file papers and assume legal process will handle any objections." "I find that conversation prevents more problems than it solves," Jorge replied, "though I understand not everyone shares that philosophy." Vincent chuckled, gesturing toward an old photograph on the wall. "My grandfather, he used to say the same thing. Vincent, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, but you catch the most with understanding what the fly actually wants." Jorge's laugh was genuine, unguarded. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." For a moment, she saw past the calculated strategist to someone who genuinely appreciated old-world wisdom. As the lunch continued, Jorge subtly introduced the topic of Vincent's daughter, expressing genuine interest in the neighborhood's culinary future. "Sophia has excellent instincts," Vincent said, his pride evident. "She understands that food is about more than just ingredients. It's about community, tradition, bringing people together. That's exactly the kind of vision that could thrive in a revitalized waterfront district," Jorge observed. "The challenge, I imagine, is finding investors who understand that restaurants are about more than just profit margins." By the time they left the restaurant, Vincent Castellano was no longer an obstacle to be overcome, but a potential ally to be cultivated. "How did you do that?" she asked as they returned to the car. "I listened to what he actually cared about and showed him how his interests aligned with mine." Jorge settled into the driver's seat, looking satisfied but not surprised by the outcome. Most resistance comes from fear of loss, not opposition to gain. "And if he hadn't been reasonable?" Jorge's smile was sharp. "Then we would have had a different conversation entirely." The casual way he said it sent chills down her spine, but not entirely from fear. There was something compelling about Jorge's absolute confidence, his certainty that he could handle whatever situation arose. "Is this what you do all day?" she asked. "Navigate between diplomacy and other approaches?" "I do whatever the situation requires." His hand found hers where it rested on her thigh, fingers intertwining with casual possession. "The question is whether you're interested in learning to do the same." The touch was electric, sending heat spiraling through her despite the professional context of their conversation. "You're serious about teaching me. I'm serious about everything that matters to me." His thumb traced patterns on her knuckles that made concentration difficult. "And you, Natasha, matter more than you realize." They drove in comfortable silence for several blocks before Jorge's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and answered through the car's system. "Marco." "We have a problem," came Marco's voice through the speakers. "Henderson filed a harassment complaint with HR this morning, claims you threatened him." She felt Jorge's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on hers. "Interesting timing," Jorge observed. "What exactly does he claim I said?" "That you implied consequences if he continued pursuing Miss Miller. He's also claiming you had him followed." Jorge's expression didn't change, but she could feel the shift in his energy, from relaxed to razor-sharp focus. "Handle it," Jorge said simply. "Already in progress. Henderson's complaint includes some inaccuracies that are easy to disprove. Security footage shows he was the one creating disturbances, making demands. His story doesn't hold up under scrutiny." "Good. Anything else?" "His timing might not be coincidental. Word is that someone encouraged him to file the complaint, someone who thought it might create leverage." Jorge was quiet for a long moment, and she could practically see him calculating possibilities and responses. "Vincent Castellano?" she asked quietly. "Unlikely. Our conversation went well, and he's too smart to play games he can't win." Jorge's voice carried a note of consideration. "But someone wanted to create pressure at precisely the moment when the Riverside project needs to move forward smoothly." She found herself analyzing the situation with the same strategic thinking Jorge had been demonstrating all day. "Who benefits if your attention is divided?" His smile was sharp with approval. "Very good. Who indeed?" Marco's voice came through the speakers again. "I have some possibilities. The Morrison acquisition has made some people nervous, competing interests who thought they had that deal locked up. Set up surveillance on our friends at Morrison," Jorge instructed, "and make sure Henderson understands that filing false complaints is a serious matter that could affect his employment prospects industry-wide." After Marco signed off, Jorge turned to her with something that looked like pride. "You're already thinking like a strategist," he observed. "Good," she said, her voice carrying a new confidence. "Because I just realized something about Henderson's timing." Jorge's eyebrow raised with interest. "He filed the complaint the morning after Vincent Castellano. Someone wanted to test if you'd be distracted when dealing with real business." She met his gaze steadily. "They underestimated both of us." His smile was sharp with genuine surprise and approval. "Brilliant." His hand moved to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheek. "Dangerous and brilliant." When he kissed her this time, it wasn't against a brick wall in the shadows. It was in broad daylight in his car, after a morning spent watching him dismantle obstacles with surgical precision. His mouth was demanding, possessive, and she could taste the controlled power in him, the satisfaction of a man who'd just successfully navigated complex challenges. When they broke apart, she was breathing hard, arousal and adrenaline mixing in her system like a drug. "This is what you want," Jorge said against her mouth. "Not safety, not predictability. You want to be challenged, pushed, made to think and react and grow." He was right. God help her. He was completely right. "So what happens now?" she whispered. Jorge's smile was all dark promise and sharp edges. "Now we finish what we started 3 years ago." But as his hand tangled in her hair and his eyes burned into hers with possessive intensity, she realized they weren't just finishing something. They were beginning something entirely new, a partnership built on strategy and desire, power and choice, the kind of dangerous alliance that could reshape everything they'd thought they wanted. She met his gaze with newfound certainty. No longer the careful assistant, but the woman who'd chosen to match his ruthless intelligence with her own. For the first time in 3 years, neither of them was pretending, and the city would learn very quickly what that meant. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe for more dark romance where intelligence is seductive, power is strategic, and every decision changes the balance. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from?